Hi, I'm Bill Schmick. Welcome to 30 Minutes. Welcome back. I'm Bill Schmick and this is 30 Minutes. And today we're going to talk about Social Security. Everything you've ever wanted to know about it. Now wait, before you get up and switch the channel or go get a cup of coffee, I know Social Security isn't the most exciting subject in the world, but I promise to do my best in making it interesting for you. And in fact, it's very important to you because the majority of Americans in the United States are depending on Social Security for their retirement age. Whether that's right or wrong, it's a fact. So let's talk about Social Security. And the first thing you might want to know is where it came from. Well, Social Security is, as we know, is a kind of a pension, okay? And we also may know that it started its life as it is today in the 1930s during the Depression. But its origins go way, way back. They go back to colonial America. I dare say it's probably the French and Indian War. What happened? Well, we were in battles. If it wasn't the French, it was the Indians. And if it wasn't the Indians, it was bandits. So what would happen? Remember that back then in America, you had a volunteer army. You had militias. So it was an agrarian or a farming society. Now, when your local militia captain or your local governor, whatever the state you might be, called on you to go and fight an Indian or smugglers or bandits, you had to leave your farm. And who was going to bring in the crop or plant the crop? Now, what happened if during the course of this struggle or battle you were injured or, God forbid, you died? And who was going to pay you? All of these issues, okay, we don't think about, but the militias did and the governors did. And so what sprang up in this country long before it was our country was a tradition of paying pensions to soldiers, whether they were militia or otherwise. Now, I guess we learned this practice from the English or the Europeans because they certainly had done that for decades, if not hundreds of years. So our origins for a Social Security or a pension system started out in the military. Now, in fact, during the American Revolution, prior to the Declaration of Independence, what was passed by that Constitutional Assembly was an agreement to pay a pension to those soldiers who served in the American Revolution, as well as a paycheck. So actually, our pension plans predated the Constitution. Now, this went all through the antebellum period of the United States, where we had this war or that battle or this conflict, and the soldiers who fought in them were injured, some of them disabled. Those who died, they had widows, orphans, so that the governments really took care of them, the people that survived. Now, it really became a big issue during the Civil War. You may know that during the Civil War, more Americans died than in any other war. I think it was 620,000 total Americans died. Now, of course, to think about that, you have to remember that it was the North versus the South. So it was all Americans involved. But I think if we count up until the Gulf Wars, the total number of Americans that died outside of the Civil War was 677,000. And as I said, 620,000 soldiers died in the Civil War. That was an enormous sum. At the same time, the widows and orphans and disabled soldiers, by the way, the North were the ones that paid a pension. The South didn't have a pension system or the money to pay it after the war. But back to the Northern cause. They won the war, okay? And at the same time, if you recall in history, this was in the 1860s, our nation was changing from an agricultural or an agrarian society into an industrial society. So those disabled soldiers, those widows and orphans were visible throughout the big cities as well as the farming communities. So Congress and the Senate, they decided that they were definitely going to create a pension after the Civil War that would be the protection for the survivors of the Civil War, for their disabilities, and for old age. So it was a good pension system, and up to 1999, really believe this or not, but some widows of the Civil War were still getting these pensions. But saying that, it wasn't a large percent of the population by then, okay? I mean, from 1865, at the end of the war, through to the last survivors, it was never more than, say, 1% of the population, but it was a very visible 1%. So the country did get used to a system, a pension system of sorts, that would protect people from either death or the consequences of death, of dismemberment. It would take care of their widows and their orphans and provide some medical benefits. And so the country was aware of this and comfortable with this. And this situation continued, but only in a war footing, only with veterans of wars up until the Great Depression. Now, you're probably aware of what the Great Depression is. It started in 1929 with the crash of the stock market and lasted through to 1940 and the advent of World War II. It was the most difficult economic period in our history, even though we had had two similar situations, but nowhere near as desperate in the 1800s. Now, it was the greatest economic disaster in our entire history. We had an unemployment rate of over 25%. There were millions and millions of people who were destitute, and over half of our elderly population were threatening starvation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt came into power, and on June 8th, 1934, FDR announced his intention to establish a committee on economic security. Now, here's a little background on what was happening. This was the 30s, and the Great Depression was a global depression. All over the world, people were in the same straits. And out of this unhappiness and destitution, a number of isms were born. Communism, socialism, Nazism. And many parts of the world were starting to embrace these isms and a rejection of a free market capitalistic society because the free markets were doing nothing for them, and they were afraid and they were terrified. So the rise of these isms throughout the world was a direct threat to democracy in the United States, and FDR knew this. Now, he came up with an idea to somehow alleviate, as you know, this depression and its effects on the American people. And we can talk all about the New Deal, but this is a story about Social Security. So we'll stick with that. So as I said, in June of 1934, he appointed a committee to go out there and figure out a way of helping the common American worker. Now, it wasn't necessarily legal. They scoured the Constitution to see if they could find anything that they could apply this to, and the most they could find was a nebulous clause in the Constitution that referred to the general welfare. But FDR and his buddies in his cabinet jumped on that, and using that as an excuse, they decided that that clause would allow them to further the security of the citizen and his family through some sort of social insurance. Now remember, communism, for example, went way beyond social insurance. They were talking about taking care of the worker from birth to death and everything in between. So in that context, social insurance, even though it was leaning left, was a lot better than the country embracing socialism or communism. So FDR and his cabinet envisioned this Social Security as a savings account for the workers' old age. okay, contributions would be made by both the employer and the employee from payroll taxes. Now, the government, according to this story, would hold these contributions made by employee and employer solely for the benefit of the worker in his old age, and that was the language, okay? Now, times were so desperate in the United States, and you know what it usually takes a committee of any sort in order to come up with a final conclusion. Well, this Committee of Economic Security finalized its report within 6 months. That's how desperate things were. In January the 17th of 1935, remember, FDR suggested this in June of 34, not a small turnaround. The president introduced the Social Security bill to Congress, and it passed overwhelmingly by both Democrats and Republicans. So the Social Security Act became law August the 14th, 1935. And initially, it gave unemployment insurance to Americans, old age assistance, aid to dependent children, and grants to the states to provide medical care. Now, other things would happen, but that was the initial idea. The first payments didn't begin to 1937 through 1940, and then there were just single lump sum payments. Wait a minute, if the bill was passed in 35, why did it take 2-3 years in order for this thing to turn around? Well, the facts are the Republicans refused to fund the program. They passed it overwhelmingly, got the kudos from the country, and then stalled on funding it. Now, obviously, if you don't fund the Social Security Act, then nothing can happen. But what did start to happen from its very first day is the government started to tax both employee and employer this tax every paycheck, and this money flowed into the government coffers. Now, as I said, the Republicans and the Democrats finally came to a deal and agreed to start funding the Social Security Act in 1937. But as I said, they didn't have that much money. And basically, the first average lump sum payments we're talking about $58. Now, what do you mean lump sum payments? What were they? Well, they were payback for those workers who were contributing to the Social Security Fund since its outset in 35, but wouldn't participate long enough to be actually vested in monthly payments. And so they were sort of paid off in a lump sum. Now, $58 to you and me doesn't sound like a lot, but back then it was. From that Social Security Act, it was tinkered with, okay? So, for example, in 1939, there was an amendment that added payments to spouses and minor children of retired workers, and survivor benefits were paid to families in the event of premature death of Social Security covered workers. So it was added to it. Monthly payments, like the ones that we get now, they only actually began in January of 1940. And the Social Security Administration, as we know it today, started after the war in 1946. Now, we're all kind of used to things like COLAs, which is a cost of living allowances, meaning that as inflation rises, automatically the payments, monthly payments rise. That didn't start till 1950. And the automatic annual cost of living allowances didn't start till 1972. Disability insurance programs, okay? They have provided benefits to disabled workers from, say, the age of 50 to 64. And remember, Social Security was 65, was sort of the target date when you retired. So this was workers that were disabled before that, from 50 to 64. Up until then, they got nothing. And disabled adult children got nothing. Well, they were included in the insurance program as of, I think it was August the 1st, 1956. Medicare When did Medicare start? July 30th, 1965. It's a relatively new program. At the same time, in that period, age was lowered to 62 from 65 to qualify for old age insurance. With the advent of Medicare in 65, that extended health care to all Americans age 65 and older. Now, of course, I know what you're thinking. My God, here's Obamacare right now. Is that an extension of Medicare? From covering 65 and older, now we're universally covering everyone. I would like to say yes, that the traditions of Social Security, the traditions of Medicare, have now seeped down to a point where American society is saying, well, if we're covering 65 and older in a universal program, why not 65 and under? Nonetheless, if you look at the direction and the changes that have occurred in Social Security since 1935 or 34, when the act was first suggested, you can see that there were amendments, adjustments, changes, that Social Security in 1934 and 1935 was not ideal. It had lots of problems. Funding is one of them. Its coverage was another. So year after year, month after month, we learned how to better improve Social Security, and we tinkered with it around the edges until it became the Social Security / Medicare that we have today. Proponents of Obamacare are saying the same thing now. They're saying that, like Social Security, it started out with a suggestion and then a bill and then the passage of a bill, and that bill is not nearly ideal and has to be changed. And like Social Security, in the years ahead, and with different administrations, you will see that Obamacare will be adjusted, amended, changed until it does work for the majority of Americans, if not all Americans. If Social Security is any guide, then it probably will work. So, if it will work so far, why is it that we've got so much controversy now over Social Security? A lot of critics say that the Social Security Administration, the trust fund as it's called, will run dry in 2034. Today's 2015. Now, it's not a lot of time. There are a lot of other critics who say that the system could be bankrupt in as short as 12 years from now. Now, if you look at it today, and if you look at it any time since, say, the 80s, the beginning of the 1980s, on a cash basis, the trust fund is called the Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance Fund. That's the trust fund. And if you look at this on a cash flow basis, that is money coming in and money going out, last year, Social Security, this fund, spent $859 billion, but only took in $786 billion. That's a $73 billion shortfall or deficit. And that's not new. I mean, deficits have been increasing and increasing for the last 10, 15 years. So on a fundamental basis, if this were happening to you, if you were spending more over 15 years and earning less, bringing in less, then in effect you're bankrupt today. But this is the situation that has been occurring in Social Security and the problem with Social Security for many, many years, and we've all known it. The problem is that deficit, that shortfall every year is getting larger and larger and larger. And there's a reason for that. It's people like me, the baby boomers, people that were born in the 40s, the largest democratic population in the United States. And now we're all graying, we're all getting older, we're all approaching Social Security age, whether it be 65, 64, 63, 62, or 70, whatever it is. We are all now demanding our rights, which is to receive Social Security. And yet, the population that is behind us, the millennials, they're basically being saddled with paying out of their salaries more and more money for us. So that's the nature of the beast. But that's not the whole story. We think that by 2026, from this year 2015 to 2026, that fund will accumulate a deficit of about $1.6 trillion. If that's the case, and it seems to be, then measured by any yardstick today, Social Security has already gone bust. Now, how have we been able, therefore, to continue this smokescreen? The U.S. plans to finance that $1.6 trillion deficit by adding to the public debt. What is that? What it means is that we go out as a nation, as a government, the U.S. Treasury, and we will raise that $1.6 trillion by selling Treasury bonds to Americans and to foreigners, okay? And then increasingly, the foreigners are buying more of our debt and therefore funding our Social Security. Now, what happens? We've been doing this for a long time already. It's not the only reason that our debt is going through the ceiling, but it contributes and will contribute more and more and more. And it gets worse. As you know, we're living in a zero or a very low interest rate environment, and we have been for the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. So as we sell these government bonds to people overseas and sell more and more of them to fund our Social Security deficit, when interest rates go up, that means we're going to have to pay more to people who buy these bonds. And as rates go higher, even more and more and more. So we're getting ourselves into a terrible situation where not only are we increasing the debt, but as interest rates rise, we're paying more interest on that debt. And this whole situation, some people say, are going to come to a head as early as 12 years, whereas the government is saying, no, we're fine on Social Security to 1934. I mean, 2034. After that, all bets are lost. Okay, well, depends on your age. If you're a millennial, that doesn't give you a warm and fuzzy feeling to know that you've been paying for Social Security and paying more and more and more, and for Medicare, and that at 2034, it's all gone. That's a big problem. If I'm still alive in 2034, that could be a big problem for me. I'm not going to get Social Security, or so they say. Now, what is true is that what we're doing is we're raising our national debt to continue to fund Social Security, and we're burying not only the millennials, but unborn taxpayers as far as you can see to fund the unaffordable entitlements of my generation, the current generation. Now, if, as what I said is true, is that we're bringing in tax revenues less than we're spending every year, how do we get to the fact via the government that we're okay until the year 2034? Well, smoke and mirrors again. When I look at the latest report, when they look and they number down the assets of Social Security, they're phony. The interest income, supposedly, that we're going to invest this cash flow, these tax receipts, and make money from them, that's phony too. When they look at the tax receipts from here to 2034, they're assuming something that's impossible, for example. They're assuming that the nation is going to grow 5% a year for every year from 2015 to 2034. We haven't grown 5% a year for 8 years. And the country itself has never grown 5% a year for any consistent period of time. Sure, once or twice in every decade or so, but 5% a year between now and 2034, that's where they're getting their projections of increased tax revenues that will pay for Social Security. These revenue projections are phony. Not only do I know it, but the government knows it. And the people that are putting this together know it, okay? It's a myth. It's a myth. What's really true is that Social Security today is bankrupt. Okay, well, how did we get there? How did we get to this point? Okay, remember what I said when FDR originally designed this and what he promised Social Security would be for you and I back in 1934 and 1935. Well, that was a concept, and unfortunately, it was a myth. And in our next show, we're going to talk about the myth of Social Security and what it's going to happen and why, and to dispel some of these myths and address, could Social Security go under or not? I'll see you then.